Hello. Thank you for bearing with us. It's so exciting to have you here. My name is Bonnie Adderstrom, and I'm the Assistant Events Director and a bookseller here at Brookline Booksmith. Today, it is my pleasure to host Jacinda Townsend to celebrate the release of Mother Country in conversation with Jennifer Haigh. Before I get to the fun introductions, I do have a boring bit that I have to go over. Firstly, please keep your phones off or on silent for the duration of the reading. Secondly, copies of Mother Country and Mercy Street are both going to be available for purchase back there. So definitely come see me at the end of the event if you want to pick one up. Also, please know that the event is being live streamed. You probably saw me finicking with the iPad. The audience is not viewable to our live stream audience, but if you don't want to be on camera, definitely don't walk in front of that little iPad tripod there. And finally, we will have a Q&A, so if you have questions, definitely hold them to the end, but have them ready. And now for the fun part. Tonight's moderator, Jennifer Haigh, is the author of the novels Mrs. Kimball, Baker Towers, The Condition, Faith, and Heat and Light, and the short story collection News from Heaven. Her books have won the PEN Hemingway Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the PEN New England Award in Fiction, and have been published in 18 languages. Jennifer is was a Guggenheim Fellow and won a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Her latest novel, Mercy Street, was published in February 2022. Our author tonight, Jacinda Townsend, earned her bachelor's at Harvard, so welcome back to the area, and a law degree from Duke University. After spending 4 years in New York City as a broadcast journalist and lawyer, she attended the Iowa Writers Workshop. Post-graduation, she spent a year as a Fulbright Fellow in, pardon my terrible French pronunciation, Côte d'Ivoire, thank you. Jacinda grew up in South Central Kentucky, and the state plays a very important role in her work. St. Monkey, which won the Janet Heidinger Kafka and James Fenimore Cooper prizes, and was a 2015 honor book of the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, is set in 1950s Kentucky, as is the book we're all here to celebrate tonight, Mother Country. Jacinda was also a previous Appalachian writer in residence at Berea College, also in her home state, so I'm excited to hear a little bit about Kentucky tonight. She now teaches in the MFA program at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. To tell you all a bit about the book, Mother Country tells the story of Shannon, an African-American woman who is saddled with student loans, medical debt, and the sudden news of her infertility after a major car accident. She follows her boyfriend to Morocco in search of relief, where she finds a toddler in a pink jacket whose face mirrors her own. With the help of her boyfriend and a bribed official, Shannon makes the fateful decision to adopt and raise the girl in Louisville, Kentucky. But the girl already has a mother, Soria, an undocumented Mauritanian woman who was trafficked as a teen and who managed to escape to Morocco to build a better life. A story of alienation, separation, generational trauma, and healing spanning across an ocean, Mother Country portrays the complex intimacies and intricacies of motherhood, loss, and survival. A book list review celebrated Townsend's insights into self, motherhood, freedom, and love, asserting that her ability to illuminate multiple realities makes Mother Country a gripping and provocative read. I, for one, am so excited to hear you speak about it. Everyone, please give a welcome to Jennifer Haigh and Jacinda Townsend.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's so thrilling to be here with Jacinda, who was my classmate at the Iowa Writers Workshop long ago when we were small children.
Basically.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm particularly thrilled to celebrate this new novel, Mother Country, which is kind of brand new, hot off the press. As you heard from Bonnie, this is really a story of two mothers. And one thing the novel does so masterfully is play with the reader's allegiances between these two mothers. So Shannon is the first character we meet in the novel, and when she sees this little girl, the child is alone, no parents in sight. So as readers, we have a certain idea about who this child is because we see her through Shannon's eyes. Of course, later we meet Yu's biological mother, Soraya, is that how you say it? And then the situation, of course, looks completely different. So, just to start us off, Jacinda, can you talk a little bit about these two women and how you found these characters?
Sure. So it's interesting. Like there are two basic stories that are kind of the backbone of the book, and they're both intensely important to me. But one's more political and one is more personal. So Soraya's character is a little bit of a composite. In 2013, I was doing some work for Al Jazeera, and I had been going to Morocco for many years, but I took a side trip to Mauritania, and I was hosted by anti-slavery activists. Because what a lot of people don't know is that 20% of the population of Mauritania is enslaved, and kind of brutally so. But it's such an isolated country that the word on that isn't on the street, and the government does a really good job of keeping people out. But I went on a tourist visa, and I met with anti-slavery activists. One of my hosts introduced me to a family that had just escaped slavery, and this woman had 8 children who she had fled through the desert with, and all 8 of them were different colors because her master had leased her out. But the 8th was, she had been born on her way out of the desert, so I got to hold this teeny tiny baby and feel kind of vicariously the power of what it meant to have one family member who had been born free. And so she was living in this tent on the edge of the capital city. It was like 120 degrees. One of her kids had this terrible cough, and I was like, okay, beyond writing this little Al Jazeera article, like, what can I do for you? And she said, just tell my story, tell my story. Mm-hmm. So she's a little bit of the backbone of Soraya. When I was doing my research, I read firsthand accounts of slavery, and they were harrowing and awful, but they became some of the backbone of her too. But the character of Shannon kind of came to me in a more intensely personal way, because when I had both of my kids, actually, I had this vision that I would give birth in a vat of water, and Bambi would come out of the forest and talk to and that's not at all what happened. They were both emergency C-sections, and it took me years to feel like I was really their mother. I know that sounds weird, but I felt like, okay, if I had failed at this critical moment, then every other moment was meaningless. And I wondered about, if you came by a child, I spooled this out to the nth degree, and I was like, okay, so if you've come by a child in this weird way of having kidnapped the child, then how long does it take for you to feel like that child's real mother? And so writing Shannon in particular was very healing for me, because I think what I kind of taught myself, and what I hope comes through in the book, is that it's what makes you a mom is all those other moments, and in Shannon's case, she's done this terrible thing, but the redemption in that, and to love is a verb, and so her seeking love and redemption, I think, is what makes her a mother. So. And you write in this sort of diptych fashion too, with Mercy Street, it's more than a diptych, it's more than a trip. There's I think 6 points of view.
4 in Mercy Street.
And so I'm presuming you have maybe this sort of same instinct to let everybody have their say, mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. It's the magic of point of view, mm-hmm. And I think, that's the most valuable thing I came to understand at the workshop, was really what point of view means, and it's probably the most important choice you make as a writer, choosing a point of view for a story. The thing that I feel, and I sense that you do too from reading Mother Country, is that you feel a loyalty to the character you're writing at that moment.
Yes.
So you take that person's side, even knowing that, next week you'll be writing from a different point of view and you'll take the opposite side.
Yes.
So it's kind of an exercise in loyalty.
Yes.
Yeah.
And hopefully, do you think you could kidnap a kid? you might think you couldn't, but I bet you would under the right circumstances, you know. And so for I think the writer, it's an exercise just as it is for the reader in understanding that we could all do anything really, and and in some sense every day we do. And there's a chapter. I'll read from this chapter. It's later in the novel, and this is kind of like so this is when they're kidnapped. My publisher calls it kidnapping. I call it tanking. So this is when they took the child, and there's a whole there's a whole lot of people who kind of watch that happen and just let it come.
I love this chapter so much, and it's so shocking because, as you say, it comes quite late in the book, and as a reader, you sort of understand that you're sort of toggling back and forth between these two mothers' stories, and then this just comes out of left field, and it's like the genius moment in the book because that's where you see the true moral complexity of this whole question.
Yes.
It's not just these two mothers; that there's a complicity.
Yes.
So good.
Yes. So I'll read a couple of these points of view. The first is Haviza Belkacem. You didn't grieve your son's death, not for 1 full year, because you didn't realize he was dead. You went to the burial, you checked your head into Driss's shoulder and wept, but it wasn't a weeping for the loss of your son, because at any moment your son was going to come running back through the front door of your house saying, "Mommy, I want a drink of water." You were weeping because of the hysteria all around you. You were weeping because the wind cut so cold against your chest. You were weeping because the words of the imam sounded so crisp and insensitive against the wailing of your mother. But you didn't understand why your son had died, and so you didn't understand that he had died, and you weren't bitter, not once, because your arms still held the muscle memory of him, and for you, he was not gone. He just wandered off and fallen off a ledge between houses. And you didn't know either how he'd even climbed up there, which made it improbable that the fall and then the death had actually happened. But in some other plane of existence he fell, and he made enough of a fuss that you went out to the side yard and scooped him up. He stopped crying as soon as you did so. He bounced his little blue ball for half an hour, and then you heard something fall, and you knew something terrible had just happened, but you finished scouring the pot anyway. He wasn't crying after all. And by the time you got to the limping room, he was shaking in seizures. And then there was screaming, telephoning, hurrying, pounding, running, shaking, voices, and more screaming. And then the emergency crew was carrying him away with his sheet over his sweet little angel's face. And then almost a year later, it happened to a man driving on the route from Marrakesh. He had a bump and his car flipped over, and though it was said that his face wasn't even bruised, he died of massive invisible bleeding in the brain, such as apparently happened occasionally to people on the planet Earth. It was only then that you realized what had happened to your son, only then that you would shut yourself up in your room for days when you heard news of another pregnancy in the neighborhood. Only then that you would see small children walking with their mothers into Savon Morgador and have to look away. And then the young girl showed up one day at the closed seller's shop with a child exactly the same size as your son, who was frozen in time now at the age of 27 months. The young woman showed up again the next day, and the day after that. She'd come there to work, and you thought it was Allah trying in his gentle way to either chide you or heal you, and you couldn't decide which, but you badly wanted the healing. And so when you noticed that the little girl alternated between two outfits all week, you gave this young mother your son's clothes. When you saw that the little girl seemed hungry and thirsty, you gave her food, money to go buy orange juice. Allah had already worked on your heart to such a degree that you wanted this young mother to have the happy ending you didn't. And when finally her fiddlers started showing up at Nasser's shop, you were overjoyed. The young mother had seen trouble, you could tell, and she deserved this. And then the fiddler went off to gendarmerie school, is what Nasser told you and your husband. And though the young mother would come out to stand in front of Nasser's shop from time to time, looking from left to right as though she were lost, she kept the taller walk the fiddler had given her. So when the American woman came and took the child down the alley, you didn't think twice about it. The woman, with her big boxy shoulders and her leather fanny pack, was so obviously American. She had a deep gash that something had riven on one side of her face, yet still was beautiful. and she seemed full of peace and light, delightful, like almost all the black American women who came in your shop. Strangely enough, the woman and the child so resembled each other it was as though they belonged to each other already. So there was little question in your mind, or maybe the second time when she didn't bring the girl back, you thought the woman got lost in the winding Medina, whose logic seemed to elude all Americans. But what you really think, because now you're capable of thinking anything into reality, is that the American woman saw the sheer delight in the girl's face, and she decided that the child should indeed have ice cream every hour of every day, and she took her back to the United States to make this happen. And you convince yourself that this is the best way, that no matter what this little girl loses in the bargain, she'll have escaped this bedraggled life in her mother's little flat in Diabet, and that the young mother will be free to marry her fiddler. And even if that is not the way, there's nothing you can do for the young mother by telling her what has happened to her child, and so you say nothing. You listen to the young mother's cries and the alarm of your husband. You touch your heart and you cry with her, but you tell her nothing. If you can turn over your son to Allah, this young woman who's too young to even be a mother can surely turn her daughter over to a rich American. It is Nia, it is obedience, it's the divine plan, to be unwritten by no human hand.
Thank you. So good. So I'm going to return to these two mothers who are at the center of the story. And this is a question that sort of has to do a little bit with publishing. There seems to be this bias in the publishing world that protagonists, and especially female protagonists, need to be likable and relatable and sympathetic. And this is a thing that makes me crazy. I have bumped up against this again and again in my own work. And I love how this novel just goes for it. Like, Shannon she's a messy person. She's not an easy woman, she's complicated. She's somebody who's got a lot of baggage, and her way of coping with what is going wrong in her life is to smoke a lot of weed and kind of hang back from it. And so she's not camera ready. She's not that kind of relatable, likable kind of, book club heroine. And that's what I love about this book. That's what is really real in this book.
Yeah.
When you were writing her, were you aware of that sort of that expectation in the publishing world, or that
Absolutely.
pressure?
And especially because it's a story about a quote unquote ugly American who goes and wreaks havoc somewhere in the globe. But she's Lando Calrissian. She's got problems of her own, right? She's got problems of her own, and I think that they're less harrowing, but they're more existentially heavy in a lot of ways. And one thing I wanted to write about, and it's something that I was bent on writing about too in St. Monkey, is the way that women are constrained no matter what, So in my first novel, it was like we had a character who had to stay home in Kentucky and raise her sister, and then this character who got to go live a life in Harlem. But in the end, even she is constrained by the sort of misogyny of the jazz world and everything. So it was kind of the same here, because I felt like Shannon, in some sense, is she's oppressed by these external forces. She's got this student loan debt, she's got massive medical debt, and then she's got the whole world telling her she needs to have a baby and she can't. And I wanted to sort of grapple with that, and yeah, absolutely. I think actually she became more likable when it got to the publisher and they got back to me. But I very much wanted to explode this sort of myth of the likable female protagonist, because I do think for centuries men have gotten to do that. I mean, some of my favorite novels are John Updike's Rabbit books, and I mean that guy is hideous. But he's the conceit is the reader's supposed to love him, and we do end up absolutely adoring him in a lot of ways. And so I really wanted to do that for this woman, and I'm kind of proud of the book cover because it was kind of my idea, which never happens, right?
Never happens.
But I thought, well, this is because we sort of want to turn mothers in literature into saints. There's either the trope of the saintly mother or the mother who has as a fallen angel of motherhood. But that's so far from the reality, you know. And so I was like, well, let's have her with that cigarette. And I love that we have this serendipity that weed is a lot of our plot. Right? That's so such
It's
a
the
cool,
zeitgeist or
you
something
know what
right
I
now.
mean?
Yeah, it's been a rough 5 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, she's got to be on this cover of smoking because
It's
like,
so perfect.
like, let's, you know, destroy that stereotype like out the gate.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel this about both of these female characters. They are so fully human and so complicated. With Shannon, a lot of the complexity comes from what we see of her relationship and her marriage with Vlad. Shannon gets married for what I would say largely pragmatic reasons. You know, that she is at a place in her life where she has no stability, she has no resources, and she meets this guy who seems to want to take care of her at a time in her life when she needs care. And so it's sort of the easiest thing in the world to slide into, and yet for her it's like walking around in shoes that don't quite fit. So it's a difficult marriage. It never really does kind of find its rhythm. And there's something kind of transactional about it that I find really interesting. You were aware of that on Shannon's side, that, you know, part of the reason she feels such pressure to have a child is she has this sense that this husband requires this of her, and the only way that her marriage is going to last is if she manages to do this. And so she goes off on this, you know, really miserable journey of infertility treatment that are ultimately not successful. And, you know, I was thinking about her in relation to Soraya in this way, because Soraya also, in a more kind of brutal way, has these entirely transactional relationships with men. I mean, as you heard Bonnie flesh out a little bit in her intro, Soraya has had this nightmare journey where she was kidnapped at age 12. You know, she was trafficked, she was enslaved, and the only way she was able to survive this and eventually escape and cross the border into Morocco was to use her body. It was the only collateral she had. And, you know, it made me think about the parallel between these two women. Like, this is, I tell my students this all the time when I teach, there are no accidents in a novel.
Right.
These are all choices a writer makes.
Yes, and I think you know, I hadn't really planned that. When I got to the end of the first draft, I realized that it was in fact a novel that was about this sort of transnational global parallel of like women having to just get from point A to point B and having to even in the developed world having to sort of use their bodies.
World,
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
Right.
And use their bodies in order to do that. I think that, you know, particularly like the set of circumstances that Shannon has going, the medical debt, the student loan debt, is a very contemporary. It's a contemporary sort of thing that is in fact making people make, you know, crazy Faustian bargains and choices, right? So I did want to draw that parallel. So and I've chafed a little bit at the suggestion that Shannon, as an American, does have more choice than Serena, because I'm not sure that that's true.
They're just different choices.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But she's also dealing with these powerful constraints that there's no way to negotiate your way out of,
Right.
you know, this student loan debt she's never going to be able to pay
Yeah.
off, and this medical
Yeah.
debt, and this just, you know, it's the American person.
Right.
And I mean, how many people do you know who work jobs they hate for health insurance? You know,
Exactly.
because their kids need health insurance.
Exactly.
So it's, you know, these are the constraints we're all living within.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of this novel takes place in Morocco, and a lot of what I really admire in this book are these really glorious passages, this beautiful sensual language that conjures this landscape that I've never personally seen, but I kind of feel like now I've visited after having read this book. And so I wanted to know a little bit about your relationship to Morocco, how long you were there, and what you did while you were there.
Sure, and I'll read a little bit about the Sahara. I'll read from this chapter. So this is the second chapter of the book. which is when Saria kind of escaped slavery finally in Mauritania, but she doesn't quite escape. What to make of this small girl's teenage mother? Shortly before the small girl is even conceived, she was then a tall, thin 14-year-old with 2 long dark braids roping down the back of her malafa. She made her way 5 kilometers north through the capriciousness of a desert that had removed her from slavery but left her 2 days wandering. In the heat of noon, she sheltered under an outcropping of rock. In the evening, she made a left turn at a sparse grove of trees and then doubled back to make a right. At night, she followed the stars, taking the Jam Shamal as a sort of celestial uncle. When she came upon a circle of tents that smelled like dangerous people, she avoided it altogether. At another camp, she begged for millet and rolled a bucket down a freestanding government well. She was grateful for freedom, happy to be choosing the roots of her small life. She wondered what her choices might mean when set against the vast Sahara that meant to render her helpless. After 70 days and 70 nights, the desert spit her out at Thumskeen. 70 days of the sun's baking and 70 nights of the moon's frosting, and the skin on her arms had become hardened and dark, like a scorpion shell. Time had been easy enough to mark in the desert, where Earth turned itself along a horizon of clean of all stars but the stars, clean of all but the stars and planets. But she had not been able to count all the noisily landscaped days before then. She rode one afternoon on the hot backside of a pineapple truck she hid under at Tamasumit, and she lent her body for nearly a week to the driver of a white minivan full of tire treads. He took her from Zouarat to the northern edge of the Sahara, all the while smelling of the oil-covered tires he'd pressed into his chest while loading his van. At the border crossing, he pushed her down to the floor of the truck and spread a newspaper over her head. The gendarme asked him for his papers, and she did not bring. When on top of her later that night, the driver dribbled palm wine from his mustache onto her lips. She was spicy sweet-lipped cute, he said, and he wanted to keep her. She ran from him in the night while he dreamed amid the smell of aging rubber. So, the Sahara was, it's been a big part of my life, oddly enough. So I've just realized this recently when I was talking about the book that I have managed to enter the Sahara from 3 different countries, and I'm so lucky because that means I've seen it from like the perspective of 3 different cultures, and it's a lot of what I wanted to evoke in these opening chapters is that you can in the desert absolutely reinvent yourself. There's a sort of nomadism that is the one we classically think of in the West. And I think that some of us even do in the United States, which is moving from place to place but staying there. And then there's this nomadism where it's like a much funner, cooler, it's kind of like the RV community, right? So there are these people who they'll just follow the seasons with their crops and they go to different parts of the Sahara. So one kind of unfortunate truth of the Sahara now is that it's actually getting thicker because of climate change. So when I first started going, this was about, the first time I went to the Sahara was 2001, and people at that point were having to drive about 3 miles to get to their crops, which before had been near them. Now people are simply having to leave the Sahara, and it's kind of this sad thing to see happen over time. Like you'll see people in the cities, like there's a city in Morocco called Ouarzazate where there are all these migrants and they're trying to live life like they did in the desert. They're trying to have the campfire and the singing, and it's like not working. But people are also sort of sustaining those cultures. So those have been side trips, but the main trips have always, yes, been to Morocco, absolutely. Morocco is, have you been to Morocco? No. It's kind of it's an interesting country because they're from north to south, and it's about the size of California, but there is a different culture in every city. There are the French, Amazigh, Arabs, Sub-Saharan Africans, everybody's sort of like blending in together, not always happily, but everybody's there together. And so it's kind of one thing that draws me back and draws me towards setting fiction there is that there are just so many stories to be
Yeah. It's something I found particularly vivid in this novel is Suria's sense of longing for the desert and this kind of longing for this way of life that you just know as a reader she's never going to get that. And it's a, sort of a story she tells herself. It's something she thinks about periodically. If she just follows the coast, she'll get there. And it's there's something heartbreaking about that. You just know that she won't.
Yeah, and it's the story of migration and climate change too, which is especially on that continent that there are so many people like that who have hitched out and can't go back.
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of work that in as well.
Yeah. So this is in some ways also a story about race, and I want to talk about that. It's a perspective on race I have never seen before, and it's a completely unique lens looking at this question. So we have Shannon and her husband, who are African American, who are in Africa. They're in Morocco, and they are taking the child of an African woman. And yet, of course, it's just a lasagna of ironies here, because the child's mother has been an enslaved person. She was taken from her own family as a girl, 12 years old. She was taken away, she was kidnapped, she never saw her family again. Now the same thing is happening to her daughter. But of course, Shannon and Vlad are African American, so they are descendants of enslaved people themselves who were taken away by force and separated from their families and their home. And so these parallels are working on so many levels, and it's a lot of the richness in this story. I found myself thinking, if this same thing had happened in, I don't know, if they saw a child in Portugal, or if they saw, a child on the street in Thailand, it would be a different story, of course. And part of it is that resonance, that they are African Americans in Africa.
Yeah, and I thought a little bit too about sort of the mutability, if you will, of race, because this child gets her, and there's a chapter later in the book where, because I had an editorial question, and that was, how come this kid just forgets her Arabic, and why isn't she in the streets telling everybody, this is not my mom, actually? And so I wrote from the perspective of her brain, which is at the age of 2.5, sort of shutting all that down just in order to protect itself. But I think one thing that is sort of implied is that it has shut down a whole cultural identity, and in fact, there's this funny thing I wrote about that nobody even questions that she's their kid because they're the same color, kind of, and so I think it maybe speaks to the fact that yes, like when you leave one, because race in Morocco is a hugely different animal. I mean, it's it's no less determinate, and in some ways racism there is kind of more insidious than it is here, because it's a little more sort of enforced, but it's but bringing yourself from that sort of racial landscape to a new one, when you get to the new one, you are automatically whatever you were as a race, right? So in Brazil, I think if you have one drop of white blood, that does not make you, or if you have one drop of black blood, that does not make you black, but obviously here it does, right? The one drop of, so I hope it spoke to that as well, that the immigrant experience to some extent is an erasure of that cultural racial identity,
Yeah, and it also speaks to this sort of the lack of nuance in the way people see a race too, because it's like, oh, she looks enough like these parents that she's close enough. Like no one is really thinking too deeply into that at all. Like, oh yeah, good enough. Yeah. So, how old are your children?
Oh, they're 12 and 17.
So, have either of them read this book?
So the older one said she felt like it was too graphic for her right now, which I think may be true. And there are a lot of hard themes in here. I think the 12-year-old might be too young, but I'm hoping they do, because they were a huge part of of me writing this book, not only in the sense of they had to go to Morocco and suffer in the summer, but also just that I learned a lot of what I learned from them. They taught me so much, and even going to Morocco as a single mom is like, I always joke, like, Morocco's like an abusive spouse, because 2 days are going to be awful, and then the third day you're going to be like, this is so sweet, people are great here. But we faced a lot of weirdness, like I went to this hotel in Fez, and they, when I got there and they saw that I was with 2 kids and no husband, like, Ben, let me check in,
Wow.
Like that went on, that
Wow.
happened to me like a couple of times actually. But a
So
lot
what did
of,
you do then? You just found another
yeah, I
hotel?
did. There was no other
Whoa.
option, you know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think like one thing that I learned a lot as an adult, and they learned as children sort of accompanying me, is that this is a land with no rules except the money you're flashing, And so to some extent, when you don't have money to flash, you need to make up your own rules and you need to get there. And I feel like a lot of that is in this book too, because everybody's sort of hustling around, doing nefarious things, but they have to. So I hope they read it, because
So what are you working on now?
So I am revising a book called James Loves Ruth, and it is it's also political. This woman named Ruth loses her father to police brutality, and this is in the late 80s. So she discards her identity and moves across the country. So the book takes place over the course of 5 days because she has decided to get divorced, and in the course of this divorce, her husband has discovered that that's not her real legal name. So she takes her kid, actually. But it's her own kid. She takes her kid, and they just start driving to California, and in the course of that, she has to think about facing up to grief, So, yeah.
Well,
What are you working on now?
Well, I have a few things going, and I'm kind of, my book just came out and I was teaching this semester, so I'm just now getting back to being a writer again. And I have sort of 2 things started, and I haven't yet decided, if either of them is viable. So I've kind of two things I'm messing around with. So here's a question for you. We are both Appalachian writers. So Jacinda's from Kentucky, I'm from Western Pennsylvania. And I have sort of a love-hate relationship with writing about my home place, and I think most Appalachian writers do. Will you keep writing about Kentucky, or you don't?
Oh, absolutely. And we have another Appalachian writer
Oh,
with
yeah.
us, too. Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm sure you feel this intimately, it's, gosh, what a place that makes an imprint on you, right? It's not what anybody thinks it is, and yet it is, and, grappling with that as somebody, because nobody ever leaves Appalachia either, right? If you left, you have really violated the code, And so grappling with all that as someone who left is, I think, a lifelong process. Right?
And it's impossible to explain it to anybody else who's not from that part of the world.
Yeah.
I have this relationship with my family where they've never visited me, any place I've ever lived. You go to the mountain doesn't come to you.
Exactly.
And that is really just impossible to convey to somebody from any other part of the world.
And it's, what's interesting, almost any sort of cultural feature of our homeland is like explicable through just plain geography,
Yes.
because you couldn't leave the mountain. You literally could not leave the mountain, right? And so, I mean, even the language that still to some extent exists, but the language that existed there until maybe 20, 30 years ago was what it had been for hundreds of years, which I think is so fascinating, because that also means like it's close to what Shakespeare spoke, and but yeah, you're not supposed to leave. You are not supposed to leave.
Well, we have a few minutes in case anybody has a question.
If I could just come around with the mic so the folks in the live stream can hear you. I'll be right over.
So I have two questions, and I'll ask them one at a time so that it's not overwhelming. But the first question you mentioned was that you mentioned Fez. Tourists obviously go to these places along with the characters you're mentioning who live there. And, it made me think how when we travel, and certainly when we're expats, often we exit the kind of moral code of our home country, and we enter that space when, as foreigners abroad, we're not judged while we're there by the same standards, in part because we're not part of that community. And I'm just wondering whether the character Shannon, to some extent, placed in that context, whether that subconsciously you feel when you think of her as a character, that gives her some feeling of license that she can engage in this kind of kidnapping at the moment that she does it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's there was a part in the chapter I read where this guy who works at the embassy falsifies an IR4 visa for her, and what she basically blackmails him. I mean, it's like, a lasagna of just terrible behavior. She blackmails him because he's cheating on his wife, so she's like, I know that you want, and in that chapter especially, it's like money has changed hands, but we're told like he's gonna be able to buy his kids like more Christmas presents, and so it's like, yeah, I think we do, and I think a part of it is also, especially coming from our culture to this particular culture, that the rules are already so bent, so much more bent than the ones we're used to, and so we're kind of like, well, we gotta do what we gotta do, right? Yeah. Thank you.
And then the other question, which is a little bit related, but in thinking of people like Madonna, like Brad Pitt, folks who have been going over and adopting kids, sometimes, or at least with the stated wonderful intentions, but I was thinking, about that question of doing something wrong with the best of intentions. And I don't know if Shannon does do this even with those good intentions, supposedly, of someone like Madonna. But, that idea that you might think you're doing right, but you're really harming. And
Right.
I don't know what you think about that more
Yeah.
broadly, and then with respect to Shannon as a character.
Absolutely. And by the time the novel was released, there was a lot that had been cut. But that was one question I had wanted to kind of examine, and I tried to do it with the whole IR4 visa thing, but the fact that international adoption can be so shady, and I have I could write a treatise on this, but people often feel like, well, it's just too hard to adopt domestically, and so they agree to participate in something that they know is not right, because I mean the truth is Shannon could, if she wanted to be helpful, she could have bought the child clothes and ice cream and left her there, maybe found her real mother and given her some cash, but and I think it speaks to what you were saying about we find a way to bend these rules to suit us when we go abroad, because that's what we Americans do, right? Thank you.
Awesome. Does anyone else have questions? All right, beautiful. Well, let's hear it one more time for Jennifer and Jacinda. Thank you both so much for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.